Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, and today I'm going to be talking to you about sonata form, that fearsome topic, and in particular classic sonata form, the type used by Haydn, really invented by Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and a few other composers since. This is a wonderful, wonderful thing. I'm kind of a form junkie. I don't know about you. I think it's fascinating because music has shape. It has structure. And even though it's intangible, once you know a piece well, once you really get it into your head, you can practically see the entire thing whole. You can understand how it's put together and what that structure is. And sonata form was about the most amazing invention in the history of music, at least after contrapuntal forms like, fugues and things like that. Because what sonata form does is it creates a dramatic narrative. The themes of a piece of music become characters, and those characters have adventures in the course of a movement. They start at point A, they travel along a continuum, stuff happens, they eventually wind up back at home, but they're changed by their experiences along the way. So it's like a novel or a play or a movie or a something. There's a story, there's a plot line, only the story is one of feelings and emotions, not physical events that you can identify. There may not be the car chase or the suicide or the practical joke, but you understand that those things are happening by the emotional reactions that they create in you. And sonata form is the thing that allows that to happen. Rather than in the previous Baroque period, a piece that could be basically happy and that was it, or sad and that was it, you have movements which include an entire range of emotions because you have an entire range of experiences. And I'm going to explain how sonata form does it, what the basic structures of sonata form are. And this explanation is going to be quite different from what you usually find in textbooks. So first, I want to talk to you a little bit about the textbook explanation of what a sonata form movement is. And then I want to give you my take on it, my understanding, because I actually think it's much more helpful in following what happens in a piece of music, particularly one that you're not familiar with. So hang on to your hats, and here goes. Now, the music theorists tell us that a sonata form movement is binary. That means it has two big sections, or it articulates a dual process. That's really a better way of thinking, because the dual process is movement away from the home key and then return to the home key. So it's departure and return. That is the process in your basic sonata form movement. The home key, and this is a terribly complicated subject, which I have to be honest, I don't understand at all myself. I'm not a music theorist. I don't understand the intricacies of harmonic theory, and that's why I've had to come up with an explanation of sonata form that takes into account my lack of understanding and also the fact that I truly, truly believe that it's not necessary to know. It's nice, it's fascinating if you study it, but it isn't necessary. It really isn't. So all we need to know about a home key or a key, the tonic is the home key in music theory parlance, is that a key is a location. It's a place. And all of the other possible places in our musical universe, and there are 24 major and minor keys and therefore 24 different places, are related to the one that you choose as home by some measure of musical distance. That is, how the rules of harmony permit you to get from one to the other. And in the course of a sonata form movement, you are going to go from place to place to place, and the themes are going to be played in those different places, and they may or may not take on different characters in those places. And that's all you really need to know about tonality. Now, the dual structure of a sonata movement, this binary form, this departure and then return, is articulated in three sections. Those sections have names which are kind of terrible, but you have to use them because it's the common coin and you're going to hear them, so you might as well know what they are. They are first the exposition, which exposes, as the words implies, it presents the material of the movement. Then comes a development, which is horrible because it sounds very technical, when actually development sections are the most action-filled parts of most movements. And the development is when the composer takes the material he's presented and does stuff with it. And anything can happen in a development section, absolutely anything. Then comes a recapitulation, which is the restatement of what you heard in the exposition. However, there's a big however. The exposition is the part where the music departs. The development and recapitulation are return. And so the departure has to go somewhere, right? So the exposition generally has two parts itself, a first subject and a second subject. And these are in complementary keys. So the process of leaving begins in the exposition. In the recapitulation, on the other hand, you don't want to go away. The whole point is coming home. So the second subject, which is located in its own key, is going to have to be recomposed to stay in the home key so that the music doesn't go far away. Now, it's not quite as simple as all that because you can still do all kinds of things. You can go to other keys momentarily and come back. You can pretend that that's where you want to go, but not really go there. There's always those sorts of ways composers can create tension. But the basic principle is that a recapitulation is going to tell you where you are in the movement by letting you know that you're close to home, that you're getting there, that the end is coming. And you feel it. You feel it in your gut. You know that the music is moving towards the end. And that's why in a sonata form movement, themes will never be exactly the same in the recapitulation as they were in the exposition, because most of the time you've got to do something to them in order to keep them where they're supposed to be, which is either home or elsewhere. I know this sounds very abstract, but when you actually hear a piece of music, and we're going to hear music, some great music, then it will become extremely clear to you exactly what's going on. And rather than get into this further, I'd rather tell you how I think about sonata form, and then let's go straight to a musical example that will, I think, make the point much more eloquently than I can. You see, my theory is this, and it seems to work pretty well for me, and I think for a lot of other people I've been developing this with over years. There are only two kinds of music in sonata form movements. It's really that simple. The first kind is the tunes which define a location, because whenever you play a melody that occupies a key, any tune, sing a tune, come up with any tune, da 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 da. It's God Bless America. Just came to mind. I don't know why. That defines a key. The tune is in a key, and the tune is the representation, the formal representation of the location you're in. That's the place. It's the character occupying the place, right? It's a tune. The only other thing that there is in a sonata form movement is music that's transitional. It's moving from one place to the other, and I call it motion music because that's what it does. It moves. It's the music that transports us from one location to another where we meet another theme, which defines that location. And so that's all you need to know about sonata form. You either have a place, a character with an emotional quality, or you have motion music. Now, the motion music can be composed of existing material. It can be the traveling of one character to another place. It can be new material entirely. It can also participate in the development, just like every other tune in the piece. All of these things are possible. That's what gives sonata form its tremendous flexibility. So the example we're going to hear is just that. It's one example. It's an example of a process, but not an example of what a composer invariably does. Because other than that concept, the idea of you're in a place, you're moving, and you're back, there is no limit to what can happen in a sonata movement. And that's why descriptions of it tend to be so complicated and so abstruse, because every piece is different. In the hands of the great composers, they're totally different. And we're going to deal with the greatest. We're dealing with the guy who invented sonata form. We're dealing with Haydn. And we're going to listen to the first movement of one of his symphonies. That is Symphony number 90 in C major. And the reason I chose this symphony is because I think the form is fascinating, number one. Number two, no one ever listens to Symphony number 90. It's a late Haydn work. It falls between the 6 Paris symphonies and the 12 London symphonies, which begin with number 93. The Paris symphonies end with number 87. Number 88, I've talked about in one of these videos. It's very popular. But nobody cares about 90, and it's a masterpiece. It's a huge masterpiece. It's also the last of Haydn's symphonies to have high horns in the key of C major. This was a Haydn specialty, a specialty of his orchestra at Esterhazy. And no one else wrote for horns in that way in symphonies over a period of time the way Haydn did. And this was the last of them because his other symphonies that were written to be played, for example, in London, didn't have those high horns. He couldn't count on them, so he didn't write for them. That gives the symphony a brilliance and a tension in the orchestration that's quite wonderful. It really is. It's marvelous. So we're going to play and listen to and discuss the first movement of Symphony number 90. Now, already, Symphony number 90 breaks the rules. Why? Because the first movement begins with an introduction. And that introduction is really pretty fascinating. I don't have a musical example of the first 2 notes of the introduction, so I'm going to tell you what they are. It goes, ta-da! That's all you need to know. That's the introductory 2 notes. Then the introduction proceeds, and I want you to hear the ideas that the introduction contains. Then when we get done with all this stuff, we're going to run the whole movement straight through. So don't worry about the fact that it appears in fragments. The introduction contains 2 distinct ideas. Here's the first. Now, what is that? It's just plonk, 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 right? It's just, it's nothing. It's a nothingness. It's 6 little notes, but it's really something. Why? Because it's already an idea. The first thing you need to know about Haydn particularly is that his ideas are just that. They're not just tunes. They're anything that can happen musically can be a theme, a subject, an idea. And this is an idea. What is it? The idea is a dynamic pattern. Soft, soft, loud, right? Plonk, 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 plonk. That's it. Soft, soft, loud. That's an idea. As of yet, it's the introduction. We don't know what it has to do with anything, but that's one idea. Here's the next. Now that is an actual theme, right? That's a theme. It has a melody. It's actually a closing cadence, isn't it? It's an ending, right? I mean, it ends very comfortably somewhere. You could go home after doing that and you would feel perfectly satisfied that you had uttered a complete musical thought, right? Okay, so that is one of the 2 ideas that makes up the introduction, and that's all we know. That's the introduction. Now we're going to get to the exposition. And I'm going to run the entire exposition through, and then we'll take it apart bit by bit. So here it goes. Now, you should have recognized what we heard in the exposition because its ideas are contained entirely in the introduction, at least the first subject's ideas. Let's listen just to the first subject. You already know the theme, right? That was played slowly in the introduction, and it leads off the exposition as part of the first subject. But the other part is three little squiggles. Notice the dynamics, though. Da 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 dum, ba da 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 dum, da 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 dum. Soft, soft, loud. That's the other idea from the introduction. These are little 7-note squiggles, but they are developments of that idea from the introduction, that dynamic pattern. And this is the first thing you need to know about Haydn and about sonata forms in general, which is the exposition, which presents the themes, may not even be the exposition at all because Haydn's already developing things from the introduction. The music develops continuously. What matters isn't so much what the sections are called and where you put things. It's what happens, where the music is going, whether it's going away from home or returning to home. And that's the process that you always have to keep in mind. So that is the first subject. And it's not really a tune, is it? It has two distinct ideas. It has the theme from the introduction and the dynamic pattern from the introduction. And then the theme again, so it has an A-B-A shape. That is your first subject in the symphony. Next comes motion music, because we're going to go to the second theme, the second subject. So now let's listen to the motion music. All right, now, it couldn't be clear as motion music, could it? It's loud, it's noisy, it's pounding brass. It doesn't really have a theme in it, does it? It's basically it's just motion, it's noise, it's activity, it's rushing, it's moving, it's motion. That's what motion music does, it moves. And now the second subject. Now, that couldn't be more different from the first subject, could it? The first subject was short, brief, punchy, widely contrasted in dynamics. This is one beautiful lyrical theme for the solo flute, and that's all it is. The rest of the exposition is motion music again, because now it has to decide where it's going to go next. And in a sonata form movement like this one, it has two choices. It can either go back to the beginning and be repeated from the beginning of the exposition, or it can go into the development section. And Haydn does always what's most unexpected. There's no question. You're never going to know what's going to happen next. And so I'm going to let you hear the rest of the motion music, and then we'll move on to discuss the rest of the movement. So now we're ready to go to the development section, and I'm only going to play it for you when I play the whole movement. We're not going to dissect it minute by minute, because the whole point is that it's a continuous plethora of activity based on what we've already heard. If you know the first subject and the motion music and the second subject, then you'll know the development. You'll understand exactly what's going on as it's played. The only thing I would stress is that that little dynamic pattern, that second part of the exposition's first subject, da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-dum, it has 7 notes, right? 7 notes, 7 notes, 7 loud notes. Just be able to count to 7. If you can count to 7, you will be all set, because that's going to be one of the main motives that's uniting the development section together. In fact, in the middle of the development section, and I'm not going to tell you where, you're going to hear it for yourself and you'll know it. The second subject, that beautiful flute theme, comes back, but underneath you'll hear da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. You'll hear that furtive little 7-note motive that prowls its way through the development section. Anyway, from there, we come to the recapitulation. And the interesting thing about the recapitulation, and the part I really want to stress, is that because the music is not going to change key between the first and second subjects, what has to change, even more than the themes themselves, is the motion music, because it isn't going where it used to go. In fact, it's completely different in this case. So here's the original motion music. And now listen to the motion music in the recapitulation. Totally different, right? In fact, it stays thematic. It's based on primarily that first theme. That's what it becomes. It becomes its own motion music. Why? Because it isn't really going anywhere. So Haydn doesn't have to give us the idea that we're moving on to something else. Now the second subject returns. It's played on the oboe this time, and then the motion music finishes up the recapitulation, and there's a tiny, tiny coda in which Haydn has a little joke. Now, a coda is a tail. It's an ending. It exists to provide the ending. Now, you remember that first subject, that first tune, da 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 dum bum bum ba da 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 dum, which I've now done 1,000 times, and you're going to hear 1,000,000 times. It's an ending, right? So you'd think that's how the movement's going to end, right? Wrong. Haydn ends with that 7-note loud outburst. It's a joke. It's a surprise. You don't know how it's going to end until it actually ends. And so now what I'd like to do is run the entire movement all the way through. It's about 6.5 minutes long. It's not long, but oh my God, what a world of expression there is in this music. And the more you hear it, the more you'll hear in it. I mean, it's just incredible. You just begin to be amazed. Not just it's lively, it's cheerful, it's lyrical, it's sweet and charming, and it's sentimental. It's all of those things, you know? But it's full of surprises and joy and energy and excitement. It's a world all by itself, and it's a drama. It's a story of 2 ideas, 2 themes, 2 subjects, whatever you want to call them, that make their way through some kind of dramatic event. till we get to the end. So anyway, let me stop talking and you start listening. All 6.5 minutes. All right, that's Haydn's Symphony Number 90, the first movement. And I think that this discussion of sonata form hopefully has shown you how you can build a movement simply on two basic principles: on defining your place and driving, flying, taking the train, moving musically from one place to another. That's all that's happening here. But that's all that you need to do, because that's exactly what happens in a play or in a show, right? You have dialogue, you have scenes, you have events where things happen, and then the scene changes and something happens someplace else. And then eventually there's a resolution. This is the musical equivalent of that process. And the fact that Haydn was able to create a music equivalent of that process, because make no mistake, Haydn did create it. Nobody did things musically the way Haydn did them before Haydn did them. Makes him one of the most astounding geniuses that ever lived. I talk about this particular movement also in my book on Haydn, which I recommend highly, of course, if you're interested. And I hope that this little talk has given you some insight into what to listen for in these symphonic first movements by the classical masters. No two are alike, but all of them have the same general purpose: the idea of departure, return, and a dramatic incident of events that will allow the composer to embody a range of emotions in a very, very small, usually tight little space. You can just put so much music in there when you build things the way Haydn builds them, and Mozart builds them, and Beethoven, and then later composers who did things somewhat differently. But we can talk about that too in further discussions, because as I said, I'm a form junkie, and if I have a chance to start talking about form, I'm never going to stop talking about form. And so now it's time for me to stop talking about form. I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I hope it's given you some insights that you may not have had before. Thank you, and keep on listening.